Welcome to the Gulf Intelligence Daily Energy Markets live video podcast on Thursday, May the 12th, a day when Brent crude is standing at around $106, down a smidgen, but still in that range of 100 to 110. That seems to be its natural home for the time being, virtually. It hasn't closed one day below $100 for the past month. But it's being knocked around by some incredibly strong winds, and it's hard to tell which of the three main factors, I think, is the determining one. The war in Ukraine is becoming a bloody war of attrition in military terms, but the effects on energy markets are intensifying with more serious interruptions to gas flows to Europe. More on that a bit later. The second pressure coming from the financial world, principally the USA, where stock markets are slowly tanking. I don't think that there has been as much comment on this as there should have been. The S&P is below 4,000 mark, giving up all the gains of the past year, and inflation is at 8.3%. The third pressure from China, which seems to be going through a prolonged bout of self-harm in its zero COVID policy, seriously affecting the global economy. Tesla stopped producing cars in Shanghai this week for want of parts for its main production plant there. Is that a straw in the wind? I want to go first to Dr. Carol Knackley, CEO of Crystal Energy. Carol, hello. Give us your macro wrap-up on the world as you see it this week, if you would, and your take specifically on the gas situation in Europe. It seems that we have a tit-for-tat with Russia versus the rest. Now Ukraine says it can't guarantee gas supplies through the country. I must say it was surprising to me that they were still moving through Ukraine. But your take on all that, please, Carol.
Good morning, Frank. Good morning, everyone. Well, you summarized it all in your opening remarks. You highlighted the key moving parts. If I start with the gas picture here in Europe, what happened yesterday frightened the markets a little bit because we saw an increase in prices, spot prices, European prices, by around 7%. But then when people realized that actually the supplies were restored and they were getting different perspective from the Ukrainians, from the Russians, the prices cooled down a bit. Now, it's interesting to see that it's absolutely true that despite how bloody this war is, it's the supplies to gas have not been interrupted. The supplies to oil have not been interrupted. But this tells you one thing. This tells you how important these supplies are for Russia, economically speaking, because this is primarily their main source of revenues still coming to their coffers, despite the sanctions, which have so far at large protected oil and gas, but also strategically, because Russia knows this is the only perhaps strong economic card, at least, with which it can influence European behavior. And that's why we see Europe, for example, has not imposed an oil embargo yet, despite getting too close to do that. A gas embargo is not really being considered because, with gas, it's much more difficult than oil to find immediate alternative, or at least the infrastructure to get supplies from elsewhere. So Russia knows that, and that's why they are keen on maintaining the supplies for gas. However, they are sending some signals. We saw how they cut supplies to Poland and Bulgaria recently, but they chose two countries that rely more on coal and nuclear than natural gas. So that did not cause a big panic in Europe. They did that, they said that the supplies were interrupted yesterday, but I'm not quite sure to what extent, because we heard the Ukrainian story and the Russian story. So on balance,
what is that about, Carol? I was genuinely amazed to learn that Russian gas is still moving through Ukraine, through the war zones. The most intense fighting in the east.
Absolutely.
I mean, how is that happening?
Well, when you want to protect something, a vital route for you, you know how to protect it. And if you have an army which can send bombs with precision, they know how to avoid the pipeline. That is important for Russia. And mind you, not all Russian gas goes through Ukraine. Actually, Russia over the years has been trying to reduce its dependence on Ukraine as a transit route. And actually, if Nord Stream 2 would have gone on board, they would have completely moved away from Ukraine as a transit route. They would have still used it, but they would have had the upper hand in the negotiations.
Yeah.
Shall I answer your macro, or shall we leave it to another question?
Just address the financial markets, if you would. The S&P is sinking. and we have all sorts of building financial problems in the USA, don't we? Inflation at 8.3%, etc. What's your take on global financial markets?
Well, look, I mean, there is one big monster here threatening markets, threatening economies, that is inflation. And yesterday, the reason why we saw this dip, because we saw the consumer price index from the US, and actually the numbers there, they were higher than what most economists were expecting. So that showed that whatever the Fed has been doing has not been quite effective in controlling inflation. It may be too early to tell, but that kind of spooked the markets yesterday. And it was an interesting article by Martin Wolf, and I think this is a kind of overwhelming perception today in markets that a recession is needed. It's the only solution, they see it, to really bring down inflation. It's not just monetary policy. A recession would be needed, and that could be a consequence actually of monetary policy tightening. And this is something that I would say the bigger factor that is going to dictate how economies will go this year, and with their repercussions on energy and oil markets.
Okay, let's move to Albert Stromquist, who is in China on Hainan Island, I learn. He's a senior partner, managing director of energy consultancy Landstrom Advisors. Albert, welcome. You are Johnny on the spot today. You are in China. Give us your view from the ground, from the street, if you like, as to what's going on there. Is this really a bout of self-harm, as I described it in my intro?
Yeah. Good morning, Frank. Good morning, Daniel, and good morning, Carol. Indeed, I would describe the situation here in China as borderline chaos. To those unfortunates in Shanghai who have endured this now for almost 2 months, they would certainly see the chaotic side of the zero COVID implementation. However, 26 other cities at last count around mainland China are dealing with district level quarantine to some degree or another. So it's a widespread problem for the country, and it's impacted manufacturing. It's impacted the movement of people and goods. It's impacted energy demand for sure, and it's certainly had a very strong impact on the economy. Interestingly, you talked about self-harm. Sky News, in an article last week, described the quarantine strategy as quarantine theater, implying that rather than as a public health objective, it's far more driven by political objectives.
Right.
From the top down. The New York Times reported today an interesting development, which we'll have to follow very closely. The second, number 2 man here in China, Li Keqiang, the prime minister, has apparently been tapped to lead a new function here in government at very high level. Call it the economy czar, for lack of another term, until there's more clarification from the government on what his role was going to be. But he has had a strong hand in China's powerful economic growth over the last 2 decades, particularly since 2012 when he assumed this position. And that's a vote of confidence in Li Keqiang on his ability and the expectation that he can, in fact, turn the economy around and manage the China's emergence from the hole that they've dug. There is no expectation that this dynamic zero COVID policy is going to ease anytime soon, because it's a political year in China. It's the equivalent of any other country's election year.
Right.
And given that, there's going to be a lot of politicking with an emphasis on political objectives rather than social objectives over the balance of the year.
This economy czar, the number 2 that you just mentioned, could he become a threat to the president if he is successful in getting the economy moving again?
Well, in China, as number 2, he always has been, but he commands a high degree of respect from the standing committee of the party, and he's been protected and ostensibly given new authority here, which could be seen by some as a power sharing outcome. But again, that's premature to say that today, and we need to follow that development very closely.
Okay. I was at an aviation conference in Saudi Arabia earlier in the week, and the general consensus was that China is the only, but also the most serious black spot on the global aviation business, simply because nobody in China is traveling. You know, nobody is flying. Is that true?
Well, absolutely. The border is closed. The border has been closed since first quarter 2020. So Chinese citizens are not ordinarily permitted to leave the country, except for very special circumstances. And tourists are not invited to come in through the border either. So there's no flux of people across China's borders and into Chinese port of arrival. Yeah.
Okay.
So the aviation industry is okay. It's sustainable within the country based on just domestic travel, but international travel is, as they've said, kind of a black mark.
And there must be a knock-on for the global economy there, I'm sure, as well. Let's move to Tehran. We are going to all the hotspots in the world this morning. To Daniel Ramat, who is in Tehran, a senior energy security consultant, specializing in the affairs of that country. And hello, Daniel. I think that you have some views and some news on the situation regarding Iran and exports to China, don't you?
Hello, I'm very glad to be here. And actually, let me say that it's my pleasure to be between you and also Dr. Carol Nachle, which is somehow a very iconic figure in this region. Everybody knows. Hello, Carol. Yes, of course, there are many developments here in the Iran related to JCPOA and oil exports to China, and of course the domestic economic situation here. Let's start first with Iranian oil crude exports to China, which, according to Kepler, the volume of Iranian exports declined in April, maybe up to 34%. That means that Iran lost 34% of its market share in China to Russian discounted crude. And there are many debates here whether the decisions made by the Iranian authorities or the oil leaders have made such decline, or for the sake of the discounts Russian oil has, Iran has lost this market share. But generally, it is clear to everybody that this is just going to be the beginning of this trend, and Iran has to somehow struggle for keeping the very limited market share of China, which has. So this is going to be a very serious problem for the future of the current administration in Iran.
So tell me, what kind of discount is there on Iranian oil to China? You know, we've seen big discounts on Russian, of course, but how does Iran oil compare?
These are not such information or such data that we can have access in public or freely. So all the information I'm going to deliver to you are based on domestic journalist estimations or somehow the news you hear from you get from here or there. The previous government and the current government had two different type of policies regarding discounting oil. The previous government, the Rouhani administration, had a sort of policy to keep the Iranian oil as high as possible and not to discount Iranian oil, because they believe that if they discount more than a certain level, it will become a permanent basis for the Iranian crude oil pricing even after sanctions are lifted. But this resulted into serious problems for Iranian oil company, and they had to store millions of barrels floating or on shore. So the new administration, which so they decided to discount the Iranian oil and of course gas condensate based on some news for 15 or even more than 15%.
Right,
But
okay.
recently the Russian oil has another story. Yeah, but there's
Okay.
also another decision somehow said a sort of wrong decision made by NIOC, which they decided to make this official selling price for even higher than the Oman Dubai index. So this resulted in a sort of market share loss to Russian oil.
Okay, let's stay on Iran if we can, Daniel, because I want to ask you about the state of negotiations on the JCPOA, and from some of the reporting, it seems as though a deal on the actual nuclear terms is fairly well advanced, but it's getting held up by what seems to be an extra demand from Iran that the Revolutionary Guard organization is taken off the terror list. What do you know about that?
Revolutionary Guards here are not just ordinary military, actually it's just a normal army. Iran has two military hands. The first is the National Army, and the second one is IRGC. But IRGC is extremely involved in economic and geopolitical actions of the Iranian government. So not only the government, but the whole system, because you know that the whole Iranian political system consists of many elements, and one of them is the government. Anyway, IRGC is deeply involved in oil trade and oil business, and also in financial markets. So if the IRGC remains sanctioned, this means that a very considerable part of the Iranian economy is going to remain sanctioned.
Okay, I
get
it.
So this is very important for the government, for Iran in negotiations.
Okay, but the IRGC is also involved in the attacks around the rest of the region too, through various militias, isn't it? Can they legitimately ask to be taken off that terror list while these attacks continue?
What I think is the two sides need to get to a sort of conclusion if they want to somehow, let's say, at least freeze the increasing tensions between the two sides. So they need to find a midway in terms of finding a sort of not a permanent solution, but a reliable one. Based on my understanding, IRGC has different branches which are involved in different issues, and some of them are not technically linked to each other that much. One of the scenarios that the two sides may agree on is removing the whole IRGC from the list of terrorist organizations, and just keeping part of that, which is the Quds force, which is involved in operations and supporting its proxies out of the country. So probably, I'm not sure, because I'm not directly in touch with the Iranian politicians, but I know that probably they would agree on a sort of
Sorry, we lost you then for a moment. Could you say that again? Because that's quite a crucial point. They could agree to spin off the Quds force, you're saying? I think we have an issue there.
Would remain. Hello?
Yeah,
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, I think Iran would agree that Quds force would remain sanctioned or remain in the so-called terrorist organization list, and the rest of IRGC, which is responsible for controlling a big portion of the Iranian economy, removed from the list. Because if that organization is listed as a terrorist organization, it would be automatically remain sanctioned, and by that, a very, very important part of the Iranian economy is going to remain sanctioned by that. So I think that could be a conclusion for that. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to Carol again. Carol, one of the items on the news agenda today is to the effect that Mario Draghi, the Italian Prime Minister, floated the idea with President Biden of an oil purchasers cartel, which I presume would want to cap oil prices globally. I'm not sure how OPEC would react to that. Maybe they would try to pass a bill through the Saudi parliament to declare them illegal. What do you think, Carol? Is there any mileage in that idea at all?
I think that in times of crisis, when governments are looking for something to blame, they can come up with some crazy conclusions and recommendations. That by itself is pretty dangerous. Well, if you think that a cartel is bad and you believe that cartel is bad, it's bad, full stop, whether it's producer or a consumer.
Yeah, whether it's yours or somebody else's.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I know that throughout history, Western power had double standards. You remember one of the first cartels actually in the industry was the private sector, the international oil companies, and not the sovereign states of OPEC. Anyway, so I don't know how this idea would work. I think governments are trying to find a way, at least for major consuming countries, to show that they are trying to do something to deal with this kind of increasing pressure on prices. But really, you have to let the market do their wonders. At the end, they clear. Yes, they may take time to clear, but we are in uncharted territories. You have a raging war happening in Europe that happened just at the end of a pandemic, which is still alive and kicking in countries like China. And we heard the World Health Organization, WHO, warning that China's policy can be counterproductive in a way that was going to fuel the spread, not contain the spread of COVID, and it's producing different variant. And at the same time, you have the macro outlook, which is the fear of recessions becoming more and more of a more probable scenario than it was perhaps last week or the previous months. So let the markets do their wonders and forget these crazy ideas of creating new organizations, which may be worse than what you already have out there.
Sure. Let me go back to Albert. As I mentioned, I was in Saudi Arabia earlier this week, where all the talk in the energy sector, at least, was of the need to guarantee energy security. Prince Abdulaziz bin Salman, the Saudi energy minister, said that he'd never seen a situation like it, and that the world is running out of spare capacity. Albert, what's your view? Is that true?
How do you define spare capacity?
Exactly.
To begin with, I mean, why would any producer want to constrain their ability to produce after having invested capital to achieve that plateau of production? That seems counterintuitive economically, that there would be spare capacity. It can mean to the Saudis actually increasing the well flow from certain fields, but that's a transient. That has to be managed very, very carefully, and it only has a certain lifetime before it has to roll back again. Otherwise, it creates long-term reservoir damage. So I've never really bought into this concept of all this hidden spare capacity around the world. I think producers produce what they can and sell what they can, and that's normal course of business.
Okay, I want to pull up today's question, please. And by way of background, we saw a report from Paul Sheldon, who is with S&P, earlier this week, who said that global production would be down 2.8 million barrels per day by August because of the Russia situation. So the question today is, by the end of Q3, how much oil will have been lost from global supply because of Western sanctions on Russia? And this is a single choice response, please. Will it be 1 million barrels, which is roughly where it is today, maybe a little bit more today? Will it be 3 million, which is where I believe IEA said it would be? Or would it be the full caboodle of Russian oil production, around 7 million barrels? Let's have your views on that, please. So let me ask the three of you how you are seeing the coming week. Let's, what's on your agenda? Daniel, tell me what you're looking at in the coming week. What are the things that are going to determine your in-tray and your out-tray in the coming week?
The most important point here in this country, and regarding my point of view to the market, is there are two type of crude oil in the market right now. We have, which I call one of them the tough oil, and the other one is the easy oil. Based on my understanding, there is oversupply in the so-called tough oil, which is the sanctioned oil, Iranian, Venezuelan, and Russian oil. And the easy oil we have shortage of easy oil in the market. Considering that these two, because of the different financial and different economic issues related to each of them, could be considered as different commodities. So we have a competition in the market for in the smuggled oil or the sanctioned oil between Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, which somehow these three are trying to get to a sort of conclusion on how they should deal with the sanctions. Iranians are probably going to support Russia because Iran has the largest tanker company in the world to support Russia for delivering their oil to Asian markets, and also Russia would give Iran some financial assistance for delivering the money here or there. So I think this is somehow more than the coming week, but the whole issue is going to be how the markets are going to get to a sort of balance between these two different type of oils. And I think at least for the short time, Russians are going to flood the market through the smuggling oil market with their oil, and I think Iran is going to have less and less incomes via their oil exports. So my focus is just going to be on how the markets are going to reflect through these flood of Russian cheap and discounted oil against Iranian one.
Okay, it would seem as though the impetus then is on Iran to do a deal over JPCOA in order to free that situation up. Albert, let me move to you. You are there in lockdown land. What are you thinking of doing over the next week?
One of the leading indicators that I'm following, Frank, is the port congestion and shipping delay times for exports and imports as well, the Chinese ports. And this is having a knock-on effect on manufacturing, both with surplus of inventories that can't be moved, as well as shortages of parts for manufacturing. There's currently, according to US shipping news, there about a 4-day delay compared to average to the West Coast of the US. And on account, I read this morning, some 550 container ships at various locations along the east coast of China waiting for berths to move in and unload and reload. And I think this is a proxy for the performance of China's economy, as well as for the energy supply and demand situation to the country. So to me, that's probably one of the most obvious leading indicators here that we can keep an eye on.
Okay. Carol, final word to you. What are you looking at this week, especially in financial and markets terms?
Well, what I'm looking at is how bad volatility can get, because we're going to see more data, at least coming from the US, on how bad say consumer sentiment is. There's also, I think, some jobless claims data that is coming out, and that will have certain impact on the market, whether it meets or exceeds expectations. But really, I would say that the biggest factor that will continue to shape markets and global economies and global geopolitics is the war in Ukraine. how it's going to develop, and you can really expect the unexpected with this war. But let me just conclude by saying one word about the survey question, the polls question, because what confused me is about global supply and not Russian supplies. So Russian supplies, there seemed to be an agreement that's around maybe 2.5 to 3 million barrels a day of oil to be lost. But globally, this is not necessarily the net amount, because you should factor in additional supplies coming to the market, whether in the form of strategic petroleum reserves or from other producers. So that was one thing that confused me about the question. I wanted to highlight it.
Okay, well, thanks for pointing that out. Let's just pull up the result, can we? Again, just to see what people think. You know, most people have gone with the median, 3 million barrels or so, which is what I think the IEA forecast more or less. But that's a very good point, Carol. Thank you for making that point.
Frank, I also I voted with Carol on the same question. Given, for example, the U.S. Energy Information Industry Administration forecast that U.S. production would be up 700,000 barrels per day this year, right, from drilling and new production capacity. So there are, you know, a number of variables in that answer.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, it shows the difficulty of trying to get a succinct and snappy question, I think. So that's probably my fault. Although on that point, I also noticed Vicky Holub, CEO of Occidental, yesterday, saying that she didn't actually want to produce any more oil because that would be bad for shareholders' interests. You know, they'd rather have dividends and share buybacks, etc. So, you know, what a crazy world. But it's time to wrap. That was a really interesting conversation from 3 people right on the top of their game. So Carol, Albert, Daniel, thank you very much indeed for being with us today. I'm sure we'll see you all again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.